I'm going to go ahead and start recording now. But I want to welcome you all to to Making the Connection: Mental Health in the Time of the Climate Crisis. And so I think I know most of you all, but I'm Patrick Campbell. I'm the executive director of the Group Against Smog and Pollution, or GASP. And many of you all, of course, know GASP. We've been working together for over 54 years to improve air quality in Southwestern Pennsylvania in order to safeguard human, environmental, and economic health in the region. We empower residents to advocate for their communities and hold polluters and regulators accountable through education, advocacy, policymaking, and legal action. But before I go too much further, a couple of housekeeping items. Obviously, this event is being recorded. And if you could keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question or responding to a prompt, that'd be great. It's, just to keep background noise to a minimum. So if this is your first Making the Connection, for several years now, GASP has done the Making the Connection series to educate people about the connection between air pollution and health, climate change, food waste, and fast fashion, to just name a few of the topics covered. There's a real connection between air pollution and how it impacts every area of our lives. And it works the opposite way too. The choices we make every day at home or at work or at school can positively impact air quality. And if you haven't seen previous Making the Connections, check them out on our website at gasp-pgh.org. At a more recent Making the Connection, Christina Marusik of Environmental Health News and Julie Grant at Allegheny Front shared their 5-part series on how exposure to fine particulate matter in the air and lead in drinking water increases the risk of mental illnesses. They also reported how we can partner with groups working to address these issues and resources for support. And in a few minutes, I'll put the link to their series in the chat if you haven't seen it. This evening's Making the Connection is a little different than ones we've done in the past. This evening, we're zooming out to look at the climate crisis, how it impacts mental health, and what are some ways to care for our mental health. Because a study published in March of this year from Suffolk University in Boston surveyed 10,000 people from around the world aged 16 to 25 on their ideas, on their attitudes about climate change. 59% of people responding said they were very worried or extremely worried about climate change. 67% said they were sad and afraid. 62% said they were anxious. The highest levels of sadness, fear, and anxiety about climate were from people living in India and the Philippines. The climate crisis is a global problem with local implications and sources. Just today, I'm sure many of you saw it, one of our partner organizations, PennEnvironment, released its Dirty Dozen list. 12 of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, the primary cause of the warming climate, in Pennsylvania. 6 of those facilities are located right here in Southwestern Pennsylvania. We are already feeling the effects of the climate crisis in more frequent wildfires and storms, more severe floods and droughts. Those effects will continue to worsen, and those effects will harm us all, especially people already harmed by racism, economic injustice, and environmental injustice. Our collective response will require all of us in our daily decisions about how we live and how we relate to larger systems within our society to work for better environmental outcomes. Meaning, we should all have healthy air to breathe, clean water to drink, a safe place to live, and employment opportunities that don't hurt your health or your neighbor's health. But on the way to a better environment in every sense of the phrase, How do we care for ourselves or our partners or the children in our lives, the next generation? How do we care for coworkers or neighbors or friends? Because burnout is real. So is despair and anxiety. So is fear, as we see crisis events like the train derailment in East Palestine, or we open our doors to another bad air quality day here in Southwestern Pennsylvania. How can we build resiliency, prevent burnout, and keep away despair? This evening, Dr. Graham Standish, the Executive Director of Samaritan Counseling Guidance Consulting, is with us to help answer some of those questions. Thanks for joining us, Graham, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, great. I appreciate that. I will say, let me say at the outset that there's a little bit of intimidation on my part in doing this with you, because I'm used to doing webinars and I'm used to doing workshops and things, but in general, I kind of know the people I'm doing them with, and I know the populations. So it's a little intimidating doing this for people that I don't know, other than Patrick and I have had a couple of conversations in the past. But with that being said, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you. Like many of you, I'm somebody who really has always cared about the environment, and Patrick, Amanda, and I were having a conversation before where I talked about the fact that the energy company I pay to is Green Mountain, which is solar and wind. That I have an electric car, but that I've been surprised at how many people have just been kind of critical of me for having an electric car, as though it's something bad. And it's a microcosm of a lot of things that are going on in our culture. So as Patrick said, what I want to do is I want to try to give you some tools and ways of thinking for how to keep going with the passion that you have for transforming the world in the face of a world that resists it. And I want to start by taking you into my world. Now, I want you to look at these pictures right here. And basically, what you're seeing here is children who are responding to their parents. And what you can see in the background is the parents are just yelling and screaming at each other. They're criticizing each other. They're attacking each other. They're devaluing each other. And I kind of have a question for all of you, and you can kind of pop in with short answers. So if you're a kid growing up in an environment where your parents are always screaming at each other, always yelling at each other, both always thinking they're right, what do you think these kids are going to grow up to be like?
Bullies.
Well,
Anxious.
maybe bullies. What else?
Anxious.
You'd expect them to grow up to be anxious. What else?
Fear-based.
Fear-based. They may feel awkward. They may distrust relationships. They may feel depressed. They may feel angry. And I want you to keep that in mind, because as I look at our whole culture, that's the way everybody is in our culture right now. One of the things that we've been aware of at Samaritan, and I should give a plug about Samaritan. I probably should have done this from the outset. We are a counseling center that's been around since 1982. We have satellites. Our main office is in Suffolk, Pennsylvania, but we have satellites that stretch everywhere from Washington, PA, up to Erie, PA, and we're in places like Upper St. Clair, Rochester, PA, Beaver, Butler, Zelienople, Swickley, and a bunch of other places, Gibsonia, and a bunch of other places. And we do all kinds of counseling. We do marital, family, individual, adolescent, children, adult. And really, it's one of the best counseling centers in all of Western Pennsylvania. And we see a lot of people who are struggling with a lot of things. Something that happened, I became the executive director there in late 2017. And I remember at the end of 2018, we were having a case conference with our therapists, and this is where we gather together and we offer a case that one of our therapists is having some struggles with, and opens it up to the other therapists to get ideas on how do I get unstuck? What do I do? Well, before the case conference started, our clinical director, Susan Young, asked a question. She said, I've been looking through everybody's charts, and I've noticed that between 2017 and 2018, that we've had a jump in anxiety diagnoses from 15% to 28%. And she said to the therapist, are you diagnosing them with anxiety simply because you're not sure what else to diagnose them? Or is that because we're actually seeing anxiety more? And what the therapist said back to Susan was, no, it's because we've seen that much of a jump in anxiety diagnoses over the past year. It is what we've noticed is an increase in anxiety, increase in depression, increase in loneliness, increase in burnout, increase in a sense of I don't know where my life is going, an increase in a sense that people hate me. And I think about this a lot in terms of what has America become, because in a lot of ways, our population is beginning to look like a population that is growing up with people amidst parents who are just always screaming at each other, angry at each other. And this is the area that I really think about a lot. This is not a way of saying both sides are equally right, both sides are equally wrong. What I am saying is part of dealing with mental health means really understanding how do we take care of our mental health so that we are not perpetuating the problem, but we are leading people through transformation. So what I'm going to try to do in the next hour is to deal with give some ideas on how do you be healthy amidst crisis work. Because the reality is GASP and other organizations like it, you are doing crisis work. You are doing work where you're trying to transform the culture. You're trying to move us away from the reality of just ever increasing pollution, ever increasing problems with the environment, ever increasing climate change. And the problem is when people are doing crisis work, eventually that the crises that are going on begin to inhabit not only their mind, but it begins to inhabit their bodies, and it begins to inhabit their spirits, and it begins to inhabit their relationships. And so what I want to do is try to give you some ideas on how do you keep that from, how do you do crisis work, but stay healthy yourself so that you don't become the crisis also. And so I'm going to try to focus on 3 different areas. Number 1, dealing with self and vocation sabotaging ideas, because that's part of burnout, is you begin to denigrate yourself, you denigrate what you're doing, and it begins to sabotage your passions and everything else. Second is how to reframe the challenge, to stop looking at everything as an obstacle and begin to look at things as opportunities. And finally, restoring a sense of meaning and spirit and purpose to our work. How many of you have ever seen these 2 Chinese symbols? I may not see everybody, but how many of you have seen these 2 Chinese symbols?
I don't remember the symbols, but the concept that you're about to talk about is familiar.
Yes. Okay. So apparently, from what I understand, and there's a little bit of controversy about whether this is actually true, but I think the idea behind it still is that in Chinese, they have 2 words for crisis, which are wei and wei ji, and that it literally means danger and opportunity. And one of the things about the Chinese written language is instead of having an alphabet where they spell out words, they have little glyphs that are actually small pictures that represent the idea of a word. And when you look at these two words, if you look at the one over danger, it looks a little bit like a cliff with a person kneeling on the edge of the cliff, looking down the edge. And it's the idea that when you are in crisis, you are a person, it's like standing on the edge of a cliff, and there's great danger because you might fall. The second one is a body that, I think my understanding is, that is a representation of a human body. And the human body is standing on the cliff or by the cliff, but there's an opportunity there. If you stop looking at the danger, if you quit worrying about falling over the cliff, there's an opportunity now to gain a perspective that you cannot gain when you are at the bottom of the cliff or when you are at the bottom of the mountain. And so it's this idea that whenever we are in some sort of crisis, we do face significant danger. But if we are in the midst of it and are able to look up, we can discover all kinds of new opportunities. The problem that happens so often when people are in crisis is they only see the danger. The reality we have when we work with clients who come for mental health counseling is generally, if you think about it, most people, when they go to a therapist, it's because they're in some sort of crisis. What a therapist does is a professional opportunity seeker. I don't mean they look to take advantage of the person coming, but what I mean is they are people who sit with their clients who have been in crisis, who've experienced trauma, who've experienced difficulty. And what they do is help them to shift their perspective so they begin to see the opportunity to change, the opportunity to become different so that they can respond in a different way and hopefully grow and transform. Here's the thing though, whenever we are in times of crisis, they give rise to sabotaging thoughts. It just happens. Crises, when we are in some sort of crisis, it takes away the feeling of stability. It takes away a feeling of security. It takes away a feeling of constancy. And what it does is it begins to immerse us in feelings of lament or vent, where what happens is we're in crisis, we feel uncertain, and we begin to talk to people and we begin to just vent over and over and over about what's going on. And it becomes hard to stop because we're just expressing these things. But one of the things therapists recognize is that permanent venting is not healthy. We can end up during crisis, end up going into feelings of self-criticism or perpetual other criticism, or just a feeling of constant depression. The other thing when we're in crisis is that it also takes away our sense of confidence. When we're not in crisis, often we feel a sense of confidence, like we know what our life is about. But when we go into crisis, often we feel like we don't know what we're doing, that we can begin to feel like we'll never figure it out, and that we're failing, and that we are a failure. What crises also, though, do is they force us to adapt in places where we not only lack knowledge and training, but we're not sure where to get the knowledge and training. And this is the problem with anybody. And I'm not just talking about with what you all are doing, caring about the environment. I mean, this is a crisis that, we face when people are in abusive situations. When they're in abusive situations, they want to change, but they feel like they can't because they're going to lose their stability, their security, their constancy. It takes away their confidence. And to leave the abusive relationship, they have to adapt. And what happens is, well, what if I don't know how to adapt? What if I don't know what kind of job to get? What if I can't make money? What am I going to do with my children? And it just perpetuates that deep sense of crisis. And what begins to happen in the midst of crisis is we begin to have self-sabotaging thoughts, or if we're in a vocation that has to do with crisis, we can end up with vocation sabotaging thoughts. Self-sabotaging thoughts are, I'm failing or I'm a failure. They hate me or everybody hates me. Or I'm doing my best and they're sabotaging me. Or I'm so ineffective. Or I'm so disappointed in them. Or I would be better somewhere else. Or you also have vocation sabotaging thoughts like nobody appreciates what we're doing. We're never going to win. We're fighting a losing battle. This is just an opportunity just for others to speak. Can you all think of other self or vocation sabotaging thoughts that come in when you're in crisis? I guess I covered all the self and vocation sabotaging crises. But if you want to put into the chat function, you can also say what some of those are. One of the problems we're having right now in our culture is a crisis of polarization. We just are in it. And what's happened in our culture, and we are seeing this in our counseling. To be honest, a lot of people have blamed the pandemic for heightened need for mental health counseling. I will tell you, I gave you an example before of the jump from 15% to 28% that we saw at Samaritan in 2018. That was before the pandemic. We are living in a crisis of polarization in our culture between the people trying to move us forward and the people trying to pull us back. And it's not only national, but it's international. And these national and international polarizations have created heightened tensions everywhere, while simultaneously, and I can't see what word I have written there, but creating crises without definition. So we often don't see the dividing lines, but we're seeing it in our families, we're seeing it in our neighborhoods. The polarization has driven people, sorry, I have to see what I wrote here because I can only see half of what I did. But the polarization has driven people to become more crisis oriented toward life security and self. And also the polarizations cause people to shut down and deny the crises as they're facing as they're going through the polarization. Excuse me for 1 minute, trying to get back to the sharing of my screen. So, and basically, here's just a reality is that we are in a time of crisis, and the work that you all are doing, it's crisis work. I'm going to stop here and just and see if anybody has comments or thoughts or ideas or anything before I continue on.
One of the things I have personally experienced, I'm an iron worker's daughter, sister, niece, and they have built most of downtown Pittsburgh, and getting involved in this issue, shutting down Shenango Coke work, made me such an outcast that I was asked to leave family functions. That I am a bleeding secular humanist. I had to go home and open up the dictionary to find out what I had just been chastised for. This is an Easter holiday, and I was asked to leave.
Yeah.
Very painful.
Well, and it's something that's going on. And here's the thing. When these kinds of things happen, they really inhibit our ability to transform, our ability to change people, because when people become defensive against us, and this is stuff that we deal with in marriage counseling, when you have a couple where just even one side is determined that the other is evil and wrong and bad, you will not bring them back together. And that often is where we are, is having a hard time kind of accepting where each other are. Any other thoughts about what I've said? Because I want to shift in a little bit to talk about how to understand the way we think from a therapeutic perspective. Yeah, we have one who's saying most of life trying to stay out of conflicts, but sometimes even just staying out of conflict creates conflict. But any other thoughts? Let me kind of keep on. I'm going to kind of give you an insight into the therapy world, and an insight into how to understand. Excuse me for a second. I now have the questions right in front of my screen, so I can't see what my slides are saying. I want to give you an understanding just of my world and our world and the way we understand things. And this is kind of a basic and understanding counseling, especially what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the things that we have come to really realize is that when people are depressed, when people are anxious, when people are angry, when there's conflict, that often what happens is there's a chain of events that begin to take place that perpetuate the problem. The one thing that begins to happen is we experience emotional buttons or emotional triggers. Barbara, you mentioned being at a family function where, because of what you said, it created conflict. What happened was, because of your own political beliefs or your own participation in this, that was an emotional button or an emotional trigger for them. But their response to you was an emotional button and an emotional trigger for you. And this is really what's taking place right now in our culture. We live in a culture of triggers. We have cable news and websites that are just completely devoted to triggering. That's what they do. They make money. I heard a great description the other day that we are living in a time of limbic capitalism. And if you understand the limbic system is the system in our brain that's responsible for emotions, for fear, for anger, for passions, for all of these things. And basically what's happened is we live in a culture where people make money out of outrage, out of making other people angry. Whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or whatever it is, they make millions and trillions and billions of dollars off of it, by trying to get people upset. And it's not just cable news, it's gambling, it's pornography, it is sports, it is drama, it is television, it is TikTok, it is Facebook, it is all of these things that what they do is they really offer a constant cascade. Twitter also a constant cascade of emotional buttons and triggers. And what happens is when we are exposed to an emotional trigger, we begin to have a thought that happens in response. And whatever that thought that we have in response, that thought leads us to engage in a particular kind of action. And let me give you an example that I thought of earlier today, and now I think I'm not remembering what that example was. Give me a second and try to recreate it. I'm working with the executive director of an organization, and he's kind of going through a little bit of a crisis because of a family issue that's happened that the people in the organization are kind of overreacting to. And that what's happening, there's a lot of, kind of gossipy things going on there. And as we began to talk about it, one of the things that happened was that the gossip that's going on behind his back, people talking, his thought in response kept being, I've got to get control over this. I've got to get control over this. So what he does is he keeps setting up meetings with people to talk this through. And what it does is, so he has the emotional trigger, which is they don't like something in my family life. It's impacting their ability to work with me. They're gossiping. And so his thought in response to it, he has an emotion, which is kind of fear in response to it. And his thought is, I've got to get control over this. And so what I've got to do is I've got to set up a series of meetings where I'm talking this through with everyone. The problem is he's found that as he ends up having all these meetings, instead of actually diminishing all the gossip and the conversations, it's actually creating the situation where there are now more conversations and more situations as everybody shares with each other what he said in that meeting. But he's developed this habit of, I've got to, when there's conflict, I've got to go and make everybody okay. I've got to go and try to help everybody get through this. And so what happens in any kind of psychological situation is we have emotional buttons and triggers. We have particular thoughts in response to those emotional buttons and triggers that lead us to engage in certain actions that then have consequences that then develop habits. By the way, you see this in the response to the work that you all do. If you come out with some kind of push for the environment, there are people who automatically think you're a nut job, you're a whack job, you're actually inhibiting progress, you're a bad person or whatever. That leads them to actions which, Barbara, you kind of expressed a little while ago. And the consequences are it disrupts the relationships. And then it develops into this habit where now we no longer can talk to each other. Or as one of them said, I kind of try to avoid the conflict. Well, you have a thought, which is, I've got to avoid the conflict, which then leads to action, which is I disengage from everybody. And the consequences are I don't have relationships with people. And so what we do in therapy is we really try to pay attention to the button, thought, and action response. And what we realize is if we can somehow change our thought in response to these, if we can change our thoughts, our thought response, it actually has the ability to change the triggers and the emotions. So that what happens is if I can face that same trigger, but I can think about it in a different way, it can actually create a different outcome. And this really goes into a lot of the kind of work that you all are doing, because one of the things, I spend a lot of time studying and research ways of changing people's minds. And one of the things that has been found to be, well, if you're going to change someone's mind, what is the best way to change somebody's mind about whatever it is? Anybody have a thought?
Somehow work them around to coming to the conclusion you want on their own?
Yes and no, but that's, Maren, that's actually, that's a good step on the way. What they have found is that the best way of getting people to change their mind is to engage them in conversation, to validate them as people, not necessarily agree with them, but validate them as people, and then to actually summarize what they have said to you so that they know that you are listening to them and you understand them. And then in a non-threatening way, to just share what your thoughts are, not as an argument to them, but about what really matters to you. And what they have found is that when people engage in conversations, when they change their thought response to a trigger, it can change the triggers and the emotions. It changes the other person. An example of this, and hopefully this is an example that is helpful and not threatening to anybody. But Gerald McRaney talks about in his book, How to Change Minds, he talks about political activism in Pennsylvania back in 2020, which they believe may have changed the election and swung it by 3%. that led to Joe Biden being elected. And what they did was they sent out individuals out into communities where people had overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. And what they did was they knocked on the door and they basically said, I am part of this group. And I want, and we're just trying to understand people's thoughts. And so what they would do is to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about homosexuals? And people would say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm probably a 7 against it. And what these people would do is we'll say, well, tell me more about it. Like, where did that thought come from? And they would share their thoughts. And they said, have you ever had anybody in your life that was gay or lesbian? And they said a lot of times they would say, well, I had an aunt. And they said, well, how did you feel about your aunt? Well, I really liked my aunt. She was somebody who helped raise me, somebody who helped take care of me. And he said, so you're kind of against homosexuality, but in that case, you actually found her to be kind of loving and caring. And they said, yeah, but I'm worried about all the other people. And they said, well, we can understand that. If you were to talk to somebody who is gay or lesbian, do you think that would be helpful? And he said, well, it might be. He said, well, we've been having this conversation for the past 20 minutes and I'm gay. And I really, really appreciate you sharing your thoughts about that. And at the end, they said, so how are you feeling right now on a scale of 1 to 10? Where are you? And they said, increasingly people said, probably now I'm probably about a 3. And they believe that may have changed the voting in Pennsylvania. The difference was, instead of staying in that same pattern of trigger, thought, action, results, that really led to disengagement and argument, instead, they found that by listening to the other person and validating the other person, not validating what they say. So for example, if I was to talk, Barbara, I'm just going to pretend like I know your family, and I don't, but I've met a lot of people who are like that. If they were to kind of, be really arguing about it, and, I might just kind of go, well, tell me, what are your struggles with? What are your struggles with environmental action? Well, in my mind, they always have a gravelly voice. Well, in my mind, they're always being against business and they're always being against, people making a living. And, I think that's really important. And validating them is to say, I can see that. And I can see, you actually really care about people's livelihoods. You care about people being able to make a living and being able to, pay their bills and things like that. And, that's one of those things that I think is really, really good about you. I wish you cared a little bit more about some of the stuff that I care about, but I really can see where you're coming from. I think for me, I probably don't think about that enough, and maybe I do need to think about that a little bit more. But I kind of feel the same way that you do, but I think about it in terms of the air we're breathing. You're looking for people being able to make a good living, to pay their bills. I'm looking at people being able to breathe and not get sick and not get cancer. Things like that, that's changing your thoughts and your emotions to the triggers. And that in itself begins to change the way people respond. And that goes into changing minds. Are there thoughts or questions? And Patrick and Amanda, I can't look at my slides and read their comments or questions, so I may need you both to help me with that. But are there comments or questions everybody has about what I've been talking about?
I'm not seeing any in the chat right now.
Okay, well, that's fine. I think the main thing because this goes into how do you work in a crisis? How do you work in a crisis environment and do crisis work without burning out and going to depression? Well, one of the ways is changing how you respond to triggers. Another way of thinking about how to change to respond to triggers can also be, well, it's the story about the man collecting the starfish and throwing them in the ocean, where somebody, every morning he gets up and throws the starfish that have come on the beach back into the ocean. And somebody comes up to him and says, why are you doing this? It doesn't matter. They're just going to end up on the shore tomorrow. And he picks up a starfish, looks at him and says, well, it matters to this one. And he throws it back in. Changing a thought in response is, I can't do everything. I can't fix the world. I can't change them, but I can do what I can. So I've created some proverbs to think about. One is the work that you all are doing. We're working to transform the world, a transformation the world both does and doesn't want. So we have to value them to discover how to transform them. We're working to transform the world, a transformation the world both does and doesn't want. So we have to value them to discover how to transform them. The reality is, if we do not value them as people, they will not value our transformation and they will become defensive and they will not allow us to transform them. But people who feel valued will allow themselves to be transformed. This is the thing that we find in counseling. And I'll give you an example, and you can just raise hands in response to this. How many of you have ever heard somebody say, I've gone to counseling 2 or 3 times, it doesn't work? Has anybody ever heard someone say something like that? Do you know why it doesn't work in those first 2 or 3 sessions? It's because in those first 2 and 3 sessions, the therapist is trying to make the person feel valued and understood and cared about, and they're building trust. And almost never are you really offering great, meaningful insights that's going to be transformational, because you can't do that kind of work until they trust you and until they're open to being transformed. So it makes sense. The first 2 or 3 sessions, it's really, you're going to a therapist while the therapist works to try to get you to trust them. The real therapeutic work begins to start happening in sessions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But a lot of people drop out after 2 or 3 sessions, because they want something different. But the really good therapists are the ones who value them and make the people feel like they're cared about and loved about. And that's what opens them to transformation. A second one that I really want to make you think about is progress always wins. But that doesn't mean we'll always recognize the progress. I want you to think about your work. What was pollution like 100 years ago? What was pollution like 60 years ago? What was pollution like 20 years ago? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, my parents were divorced when I was 2. My mother moved back to Philadelphia, and my brother and I used to take planes back and forth across Pennsylvania between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Do you all remember the smoking sections on the plane? It was awful as a kid. We would beg my mother, please don't put us in the smoking section. But my mother wanted the cheap seats. And so she would stick us back in the back, and we would spend an hour and a half flying from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, just immersed in cigarette smoke. Well, you can't smoke on a plane now. The water. We grew up partly in Swickley, and I remember friends playing near the Ohio River and pushing each other into them, and walking home from doing that, walking across a road about 6 feet from each other because they all smelled so bad from whatever was in the Ohio River that they not only couldn't stand the smell of themselves, but also couldn't stand the smell of each other. And my one friend, Tyrone, was telling me when he got home, he walked in, his mother said, my God, Tyrone, what's that smell? And Tyrone said, well, we were playing in the river. And she said, take your clothes off and throw them in the trash, and we're going to throw it out. So they just threw out the clothes because it smelled. It's better now. Progress always wins, but that doesn't mean we'll always recognize the progress. I want to move on and basically say, in every crisis, there is an opportunity. And you all are in crisis work, but you are also in opportunity work. Lessons from therapy when it comes to finding opportunities in the midst of crises. Whenever you're doing this kind of work, build relationships first because they open up opportunity. Focus on always the basic 4 first order issues: trust. Sorry, I have to do this again because I can't see what I'm saying. Trust, calm, identifying what's wrong, offering basic steps, safety, hope. Also, it really helps when you are doing crisis work to find ways to encourage people to move onto their own healthier levels. It means trying to praise what's right, even if it's coming out of what's wrong. People respond to positives, they do not respond to negatives. There's a golden ratio that's understood in marriage relationships. It's a 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions to critical and negative interactions. Healthy marriages have 5 positive interactions to every 1 negative interaction. If you slip below it, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1-to-1, marriages are destined to fall apart. Workplace relationships are destined to fall apart. People hold on to criticisms. They don't hold on to praises. But if you offer enough praises, people will respond. That's one of the reasons why I emphasize this idea of trying to find a way to validate and value other people, even and maybe especially when you disagree. The next idea from therapy is successive approximations. That if you want to build towards something and build relationships or whatever, don't try to go from A to Z, but break things down. When I used to work as a therapist in a psychiatric hospital, we had kids there who just had, acting out all the time, violent sometimes, self-harming. And, we could say, you've got to stop being violent. But what we realize is you can't just say to somebody, stop being violent. What you have to do is build successive approximations. The first thing you do is work on finding little small things that they're doing that are helpful rather than violent, and give them points for it. Little things, saying something nice to somebody, praising somebody, picking up a chair that's fallen, giving them points for that, and then build slowly up where you're building up healthy relationships. I'm going to let go of self-fulfilling prophecies for the time being, but basically opportunities from therapy are: how do you focus on what's right instead of what's wrong? How do you build things successively, whether it's relationships or whatever? So this leads to another proverb. When doing this kind of work, pay attention to just noticeable differences. We tend to want to transform people from here to here. But if you pay attention to the just noticeable difference, trying to get a just noticeable difference, eventually so pay attention to just noticeable differences, because when enough of them accumulate, you'll have made a huge difference. What that means is, when you are trying to transform something, you're going to build in frustration when you're trying to go from here to here. But if you're able to go from here to here, and then here to here, and then here to here, and then here to here, eventually you'll look back and realize you went from here to here. And in any kind of crisis work, it's important to focus on the transformation of just noticeable differences. I don't know if I have enough time to do this right here. Well, this may be where I end in talking about this, but I do want to stop here and see, are there comments or thoughts or questions about what I've talked about so far? Barbara, I do like the fact throwing away more emails without reading them. That can help your mental state. Well, or not holding on to them, reading them but letting them go, recognizing that This is somebody who's been triggered and is responding out of his or her trigger to me. Are there any other thoughts that I'm bringing out? Well, is it okay if I keep going?
Fine with me.
Okay. There was a question. What can we do when our message is ignored? You let it go. When someone is not willing to listen to you, you are not then responsible for forcing them to listen to you. You are responsible. This is one of the proverbs I'm going to get to in a second. So maybe I'll skip ahead and see if I still have that proverb. No, I cut it out. I had a bunch of proverbs that I thought I had too many proverbs. One of the proverbs that I had is that we are responsible for offering change. We are responsible for offering insights. We are not responsible for them taking up our change and taking up our insights. This is something in the counseling world we recognize. We are responsible when you come to see me. We are responsible for paying attention to you, for focusing on you, for caring about you, for offering you honest but helpful insight, and for building up trust. We are responsible for offering you guidance on how to make changes in your life, but we are not responsible for your change. The other person is responsible for that change. And that's a really hard thing. I am not only a therapist, but I'm also a spiritual director. I'm also a Presbyterian pastor. And I learned that in my congregation. When I preach a sermon, I'm only responsible for preaching the sermon. I am not responsible for whether people listen or make changes as a result of it. I am only responsible for what I offer. They are responsible for their response. The work you all are doing, you are only responsible for the work that you are doing. You are responsible for doing the best you can. You are responsible for trying to make a difference, but you are not responsible. This is one of the proverbs I cut out, but you are responsible for your work. You're not necessarily responsible for the results because you are working on the transformation of the world, not fixing the world. And when you're working on the transformation of the world, you are working to help people move from something to something in a way that allows for lasting change. And this we've got about 5 minutes, so let me kind of close with something where I want to share with you just an understanding of what transformation looks like. When I was studying for my PhD at Duquesne, they talked a lot about the transformation process of what they called formation, transformation, reformation. Or another way of calling it is from, through, to. At any one time, people are at a particular formation or from. And when people are in that state, they're there, they stay there, they embrace it, often because there's a level of certainty, of comfort, of stability, and security. By the way, just because you're in that space doesn't mean it's a healthy space. Somebody who is addicted to drugs, there's a kind of certainty in their lives that comes from taking the drugs. There's a kind of comfort that comes from taking the drugs. When you are taking the drugs, there's a kind of stability and security that you emotionally feel, even if the situation is uncertain, uncomfortable, unstable, and insecure. Same thing with people who are in abusive situations. That when they're in abusive situations, to us from the outside, it looks scary, it looks threatening. But for them, they're looking at it and saying, well, yes, I get abused, but I have a roof over my head and I get food. There's a certainty to it. There's a kind of comfort because I'm still sitting in my furniture, sleeping in my bed, driving my car, if I'm allowed to have a car. There's a kind of stability and security. Whenever we lead people through transformation, they go from the known, into a period of uncertainty, discontinuity, anxiety, confusion, frustration, and a desire to go back. And this is just the reality. When people are being transformed, they have uncertainty, discontinuity, anxiety, confusion, frustration, and the desire to go back. Let me ask you a question. And raise your hands if you kind of think you agree with what I'm saying. If you look at the state of America and kind of the state of the world, would you say that people feel we are in a time of uncertainty, discontinuity, anxiety, confusion, frustration, and for many, a desire to go back? Would you agree with that comment? It's the reason why you hear a phrase, make America great again. You know, what's happened in America is it actually has gone an unprecedented period of transformation. We're moving out of kind of a perpetuation of a caste system to one where there's a bigger emphasis on equality. There's a greater emphasis on caring about people who are marginalized, people who are struggling and lifting them up. There's a greater and greater concern, especially among young people, about the air we breathe, about the ground, the soil around us, about the food we eat, about the environment, about climate change. So what's happening is we're going through periods of change where the climate is changing, melting glaciers, rising sea levels, more intense hurricanes, tornadoes, all the rest. And what's happened is people are in a time of and discontinuity and anxiety and confusion and frustration and a desire to go back. If people can stay long enough in those periods, eventually we will move to a place of new certainty, of excitement, of increased energy, and of new ways. But here's the difficulty, and this is the struggle for all the work you do. You are doing transformation work, and you are trying to move people from this to this. And one of the problems that happens when you're doing this kind of work is there's a tendency for us to inhabit the to area and to recognize those who are in the from area, and like prophets to be screaming at the people who are back at from, and basically scream to them saying, you know, you need to get to where we are. You need to join us where we are. Well, they're resisting because they're scared of the transformation. What does this mean for my life? I mean, I mentioned I have an electric car. My first 2 months of driving the electric car, I was anxious all the time. I was anxious about, is this actually going to charge? Will I have enough miles? Can I get from here to there? Will something happen to the battery, or all of a sudden it just drains automatically and I'm stuck somewhere and I can't, I can't walk to a gas station and get gas. It took me about 2 months to get through to the point now where I'm kind of like, this is kind of the coolest thing I've ever done, driving this car. But I had to go through the transformation myself. Problem is, I work in transformational work. So I've become very comfortable doing that. But a lot of the people who are resisting us, we want them to get to where we are, but they resist because they're scared of it. And what that means is, in the work we do, we have to help them to navigate through the transformation, which means we have to understand their fears, understand their anxieties. This all goes back into changing our thinking in response to the triggers. So I'm gonna stop here. Well, actually, I'll give you one more thought. This is my last thought, because I like this slide, and well, I just want you to see it, and I spent a lot of time putting it together. I have a phrase that I use with my clients and that I use with other people, where I say, be like water, not like lava. Now, think about lava. When lava comes down a mountain and it hits an obstacle it can't get around, what does lava do? Just shout an answer out.
It sits there until it's rock.
Yeah, it
And it might
sits
melt
there
for
and
king.
yeah, but it sits there and it becomes more obstacle. this is the way we tend to be towards whatever we're working on, is we tend to have one approach to it. And if we can't get around it, we harden like lava and we get stuck. Being like lava, water is different. When water comes rushing down a mountain, it hits an obstacle that it can't get around, or sorry, it hits an obstacle. What does it do?
Flows around.
Well,
Yeah,
lava
well,
goes
it'll
around
either-
too.
If it's hard
can.
enough, but it can.
It goes
if there's a
around.
if there's a channel for it, but only if there's a channel for it. Water will either find a way to go around, or it will find a way to go over, or it will eventually erode it over time. Whereas lava does not erode. Lava over time, if you look at it, it just turns into rock over time. It will eventually stop.
Water erodes the thing with particles that the water is carrying. I challenge this metaphor as a planetary scientist.
Well, how about this? I'm not talking
They
literally.
do behave differently.
Yes. I will
It's
say
different,
simply,
yeah.
I will say simply, I'm not speaking scientifically, I'm speaking metaphorically. So I'll just cut, but I'll change my
World's
thinking
greatest
around
literalist here.
Yes, and I'll change my thinking around this. At any rate, the point I'm really trying to make is, when you are in crisis work, when you are in transformational work, a large part of it is learning to understand where people's fears are, where their anxiety is, meeting them where they are, validating where they are, and helping them move through, which means we have to change our thinking in response to them, instead of asking them to change their thinking, because they've already told you they're having a hard time changing their thinking. But thoughts or questions or comments, yes, water can also go underground. So it's got lots of avenues. And that's one of the things that I often say to people is, be like water, where you're always looking, when you are opportunity thinking, you're always looking for a different way to go.
Alternative.
Don't get stuck in only one way of thinking, one way of approaching, but look at different possibilities. I do that as an executive director, as a leader, which is, if I hit an obstacle, I go, well, that's not going to work. Let's find a way around it. Let's find a way over it, or let's be patient and find a way to erode it. But any other last thoughts or comments or ideas before we end?
From what I've garnered from what you've said this last hour, I'm 81 years of age. Will I be around to move from, through, and get to? You're making it sound like we're on our way.
You're already there. You've already gone through it your whole life. You are 81 years old. Think about all the transformations that have taken place in your life. Transformation is ongoing. It's just that a lot of people push back against it. And part of the problem of doing transformational work is meeting them where they are and helping them navigate that transformation. So Barbara, you've already done it your whole life. You've gone through transformations yourself, and you also have led other people through transformations. Other thoughts or comments or questions?
As I approach the health department with my messages, I've tried to incorporate humor and music and some other ways to try and get them to listen, because this is such a heavy subject. I would like to see more humor and innovative ways to bring these subjects up rather than the data.
Yep. Humor is like water. It is another way around things. Actually, what they found in studying changing people's minds, data is almost the worst thing you can use in changing people's minds, because people don't trust data. They trust stories. People trust, they trust personal stories more than they trust data. It's the reason why, somebody's talking about an electric car, they'll say, well, I knew somebody once whose battery blew up and their whole house burned down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, statistics on that are really, really slim, but, okay. And that's what a lot of the cable news things do, is they just use story after story after story. And it's not that data is bad, it's just that people just don't respond to it well. if you're working in science, you let the data change your mind, but most people don't have scientific minds. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
Really appreciated the opportunity to chat with you, and hopefully you can take away at least something from this. And for those of you who are watching the recording, hopefully you can take away something from this that is helpful. Even if it's not helpful in your work, maybe it's just helpful in your relationship. So really appreciate the opportunity to spend this evening with you.
Yeah, good delight. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time very much.
Thank you, Graham. You've given us a lot to think about, like you said, for our relationships, our own selves, and our organizations that we're all a part of. So really appreciate the time and effort. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to sign off, but appreciate this opportunity. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good day.